You don't usually realize what's happening while it's happening in these relationships, and that's one of the hardest truths about navigating them while you're still in them, as well as the aftermath. Now, from the outside, people want things to be simple. They want to say, well, if it were that bad, why didn't you just leave? Or how could you not see it? But inside the relationship, it rarely feels obvious. It feels confusing. It feels intense. It feels personal. It feels like something very real is happening, even while something in you is starting to quietly warn you that something is off. And that's what makes these relationships so difficult to explain later. Because the problem isn't just that the person is manipulative. The problem is that the relationship itself becomes a psychological environment. It shapes what you notice, what you doubt, what you tolerate, and what you keep hoping will come back. So in this episode, I want to slow this down and talk about what it really feels like to be inside that dynamic. Not just the labels, not just the stages, but the actual lived experience, the emotional confusion, the nervous system response, the trance-like quality, the way your own mind starts bending around the relationship before you even realize what's happening. Because if you have lived through this, I want you to know something right away. The confusion was actually part of the mechanism. It wasn't a sign that you were weak or foolish or broken. It was part of how the bond formed. I mean, think about it. Why would someone of this caliber ever seek out a weak person? They want someone who's psychologically strong because it offers them the boost they need. It's a craving for them. A form of sustenance. The beginning feels different than danger. Most people don't enter these relationships thinking they're stepping into manipulation. They think they're meeting someone extraordinary. And honestly, that's often how it feels at first. There's intensity, there's attention, there's this sense that this person sees you in a way that nobody else has. They ask questions, they remember details, they seem fascinated by your inner world. They lean in when other people have drifted away and they make you feel chosen. That's a powerful feeling. And it's really not hard to understand why people get pulled in. We are wired to respond to attention, warmth, and connection. We're wired to bond. We're wired to feel relief when someone appears to understand us. So when a person comes along who seems deeply interested, unusually focused, and emotionally available in the beginning, it feels like a gift. It doesn't feel like a warning. It feels like a homecoming, and that's part of the problem. The relationship doesn't usually start with cruelty. It starts with what feels like emotional rescue. It starts with acceleration. It starts with a level of interest that feels flattering, intoxicating, and hard to question because it's so emotionally rewarding. And once the relationship starts to move that fast, your brain starts adapting to the pace. You begin organizing your attention around them. You start checking your phone more often. You replay conversations. You think about the next text, the next date, the next moment of connection. And this is where the relationship begins to work on you in a deeper way. A lot of survivors struggle to describe this part because it doesn't feel like being tricked in the obvious sense. It feels more like being absorbed. There's a narrowing of focus, a kind of emotional tunnel vision because the relationship is occupying more and more of your attention and emotional energy. Other parts of life can start slipping into the background. Friends might notice it before you do, and you may find yourself talking about them more, thinking about them more, and defending the relationship more. That's one of the strange things about these dynamics. The relationship begins to shape your reality before you fully recognize it. You may still be functioning, you may still be working, parenting, showing up, taking care of life, but inside something is changing. Your emotional system is becoming oriented around that person. And that's part of what Sandra Brown, author of Women Who Love Psychopaths, has described when she talks about trance hypnosis and suggestibility in pathological relationships. It's not something theatrical like stage hypnosis. It's not as obvious as that. It's something more relational, more subtle, more psychological. The person's intensity can create a state of fascination, and fascination is powerful. When you're fascinated, you're not neutral, you're leaning in. You're tracking, you're trying to make sense of what you're seeing. You're hoping for more of the good version of them, and while you're doing that, your critical thinking can soften just enough to miss what your body's already noticing, and that's an important distinction. People often think survivors miss the signs because they were naive, but very often they did notice the signs. They just didn't yet have the emotional clarity to interpret them correctly. And because the early bond is so strong, the mind starts explaining away the inconsistencies. The clues are there, but they don't feel alarming. Yet, this is where the relationship gets tricky because there are usually clues early on. Maybe there's a story that changes. Maybe there's a strange coldness under their charm. Maybe the way they talk about their exes feels a little bit off. Maybe there's a rush of intimacy that's a little too fast. Maybe you feel unusually anxious and unusually excited at the same time. Maybe something in your gut feels tight, but the connection is so compelling that you ignore it. That's the thing about intuition. It doesn't always arrive as a clear sentence. Sometimes it arrives as discomfort. Sometimes as hesitation, sometimes as a tiny internal flinch that gets drowned out by chemistry, attention, and hope. And hope is another huge part of how these relationships hold people. Because once you've experienced that early intensity, you don't just want the relationship to continue. You want the feeling you had in the beginning to come back. You keep reaching for the version of them that felt warm and attentive and emotionally alive. You tell yourself the distance is temporary. You tell yourself they're just stressed. You tell yourself you must have misunderstood. You tell yourself that if you're patient enough, loving enough, calm enough, understanding enough, it'll return. And while that is a very human response, it's also part of what keeps the bond alive. One reason these relationships can be so destabilizing is that the manipulation often starts really small. A slight criticism, maybe a dismissive comment, a shift in their tone, teeny tiny little white lie, a moment where you feel something was just not quite right, but you can't quite prove it. And because you care about the relationship, you may try to smooth it over instead of confronting it. After all, every relationship has awkward moments, right? Nobody's perfect, and this is probably normal. The problem is that the relationship isn't moving toward greater safety and honesty, it's moving toward greater confusion. And confusion is exhausting. When someone is warm one day and cold the next, affectionate one moment and critical the next, your mind starts working overtime trying to predict the pattern. You start monitoring their tone, their mood, their timing, their facial expressions. You become hyper aware because you're trying to prevent the next rupture before it happens. That state can feel like love, but it's really surveillance. You aren't relaxed, you're managing. You aren't secure, you're scanning. You aren't growing in freedom. You're shrinking your own behavior to keep the peace. And the tragedy is that many people don't see that shift until much later. A psychopathic or highly exploitative relationship often doesn't begin with obvious domination. It begins with subtle power shifts. Maybe they want more access to you than feels comfortable, but they frame it as closeness. Maybe they ask you where you are all the time, but say it's because they care. Maybe they dislike your friends, but say they're a bad influence. Maybe they cast themselves as the only one who really understands you. Maybe they're always the one with the stronger story, the louder confidence, and the better explanation. And because the relationship has already created emotional intensity, those moves can feel believable. That's one of the most painful parts of coercive control inside an intimate relationship. It often arrives dressed as concern, devotion, or intimacy. You won't hear, "I want to control you." You're going to hear, "I just want to protect you. I know what's best for us. I'm the only one who really gets you. Your friends don't understand you like I do. You're being too sensitive. You're overreacting." And slowly, the relationship starts becoming a world with fewer witnesses and more confusion. That's not on accident. The fewer outside points of reference you have, the easier it becomes to distort your reality. One of the things I want to make very clear here is that people often feel this kind of relationship in their body before they can explain it in words. You might feel tense around them even when nothing bad is happening. You may feel relief when they're kind, as if you had been bracing for impact. You may feel a knot in your stomach when their name pops up. And you might feel like you're always on the edge of either closeness or crisis. That chronic tension isn't meaningless. The nervous system is often picking up what your mind is still trying to rationalize. This is why survivors can end up feeling so depleted. It's not just heartbreak. It's sustained internal stress. It's the emotional labor of trying to keep a shifting relationship stable. It's the pressure of trying to prove your worth to someone who keeps moving the goalposts. It's the pain of loving someone who keeps making you doubt your own reality. And over time, that kind of strain changes you. You might get quieter, become more careful, stop bringing up your needs because it never seems to help. You even stop trusting your own memories. And you may start asking other people, does that seem normal to you? You're likely to become more anxious, more tired, more self-conscious, and less like yourself. That loss of self is one of the deepest wounds these relationships leave behind. One of the most powerful mechanisms in these relationships is intermittent reinforcement. That means the affection is unpredictable. The warmth comes and goes. The connection isn't steady. Instead, there's a cycle of reward and withdrawal. And that unpredictability makes the bond stronger, not weaker. Because when love is inconsistent, your mind often becomes preoccupied with trying to get back to the good part. If they're kind again, you feel relief. If they give you a tender moment, you cling to it. If they say sorry in the right tone, you want to believe them. If they give you just enough affection after distance or cruelty, it can feel like proof that the relationship is still there. But what you're really responding to is the relief of not losing them. It's important to make that distinction here. The relationship can become less about joy and more about tension release, less about connection and more about rescue from disconnection. That kind of cycle creates powerful attachment because your brain starts learning that the reward is unpredictable but possible. So you keep trying, you keep hoping, you keep waiting for the good version to return. And that waiting can go on for a very long time. People outside the relationship often think that the red flags should have been obvious, but they forget several things. First, these people can be highly charming. They can be socially skilled. They can appear caring, polished, articulate, and even admirable to everyone else. So when the relationship starts to feel wrong, the outside world may not validate your experience. In fact, people may reinforce the opposite. They seem great. They've always been nice to me. Are you sure you're not being too sensitive? And that external validation can make you doubt yourself even more. Second, the relationship often evolves gradually. You don't usually go from idealization to full-blown abuse overnight. It's more often a slow erosion, a little less kindness, a little more criticism, a little more control, a little more confusion, a little less of yourself. That gradual pace makes it hard to identify a clean turning point. Third, many people try very hard to make their relationships work. They're invested, they love deeply, and they're loyal. They don't want to believe the person they care about is harmful. And that loyalty can be used against them because the more sincere you are, the more willing you may be to explain, forgive, and keep trying. That doesn't mean you're gullible. It means you were trying to love in good faith. Now, at some point, the relationship shifts. Sometimes it's subtle at first, sometimes it's more obvious. Their warmth starts to thin out. The admiration they once had for you is now criticism. The closeness becomes distance. The same things they once loved about you may now be treated like flaws. Your sensitivity is a problem, your questions are a problem, your needs are a problem, your reactions are a problem, and this can be deeply destabilizing because you're still carrying the memory of how good it felt at the beginning. So now you're living with two realities at once. One reality is the relationship you're in now. The other reality is the relationship you thought you were entering. That split can make people feel frantic inside, and they keep comparing the present to the beginning, asking, what happened? They keep trying to restore what once felt magical, and that's often where the pain deepens, because now they're not only being hurt, they're grieving a relationship that may never have been what it seemed. That grief is very complicated. It's grief for the person, grief for the future you imagined, grief for the version of yourself that felt open and alive in the beginning, and often grief for the self-trust that got worn down along the way. People who've never been inside one of these relationships sometimes imagine leaving is a matter of making the decision and walking out. But leaving can feel terrifying because the bond is still active. Your body may still be attached, and your mind may still be hoping. Your nervous system may still be conditioned to seek relief from the very person causing the pain, and that is why survivors can feel pulled back in even after they know better. Because the attachment was built under intense emotional conditions. The bond was reinforced through confusion, reward, fear, and hope. And the relationship has left an imprint that doesn't disappear just because the truth finally becomes clear. That's also why people can leave and still miss them. They don't miss the abuse, they miss the early intensity. They miss the fantasy of being seen. They miss the version of the relationship that felt meaningful before it became unbearable. And if you've lived that, I want you to know, missing them does not mean they were good for you. means your nervous system is still recovering from what it had to adapt to. After the relationship, many survivors go through a phase that's hard to explain to other people. You might replay conversations, question yourself, wonder how you could have been so drawn in, ask whether the good parts were real, or wonder if you did overreact. There's embarrassment, anger, sadness, numbness, or all of the above. Maybe you don't just miss the person, maybe you miss who you were before the relationship started reshaping you. That can be one of the most painful parts, because recovery is not only about separating from the other person, it's also about reclaiming your perception, rebuilding trust in your own instincts, and learning that discomfort is information. Learning that confusion is not consent. Learning that love doesn't require you to abandon yourself. Healing starts in part when the pattern becomes visible. Not just the behavior, but the pattern, the sequence. The way charm, intensity, confusion, control, and withdrawal all work together. Once you can see the structure, the relationship stops feeling like a mystery and starts feeling like a mechanism. That shift is so important, because the more clearly you see it, the less you blame yourself for missing it. You begin to understand that this wasn't just a bad relationship, it was a relational pattern that relied on your capacity to bond, hope, and make meaning. And those aren't flaws, those are human strengths. They were simply used against you. Recovery often means slowly learning how to trust yourself again. And that can look like noticing when your body tightens. It can look like paying attention to inconsistency instead of dismissing it. It can look like not rushing into closeness just because someone feels intense. It can look like choosing steadiness over chemistry. It can look like believing yourself the first time something feels off. That's not paranoia, that's wisdom. If this episode put words to something you've lived through, I want you to know you're not alone. What happens inside these relationships is often deeply confusing. And that confusion is part of why people stay, why they doubt themselves, and why leaving can take so much more than willpower. But the more you understand the pattern, the more you can begin to see it sooner. And once you can see it, you're not as easy to pull into the trance of charm, intensity, and self-doubt. You start noticing the pacing. You start noticing the inconsistencies. You start noticing what your body's trying to tell you, and that's where healing begins. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you are in the middle of this kind of relationship right now, I want to encourage you to reach out for support. You don't have to sort this all out alone.